Right, let's cross live to the National Arboretum, where the King and Queen are arriving at a commemorative event to honour our heroes on the 80th anniversary of VJ Day.
So you are watching on your screens now live pictures of His Majesty the King and Queen arrive at the National Memorial Arboretum in Staffordshire. There is a guard of honour and the bands of His Majesty's Royal Marines, Portsmouth. His Majesty just greeting the Prime Minister there, alongside senior military officials. This is, of course, particularly poignant for the King because it was his grandfather, King George VI, 80 years ago, who delivered the message to the nation, the Commonwealth and the Empire, declaring that the war is over. And His Majesty now here to greet the 33 veterans at the National Memorial Arboretum who fought in the Far East in the latter stages of the Second World War between the ages of 96 and 105. We're just seeing this guard of honour now, His Majesty inspecting his armed forces as he begins to walk towards his seat at the National Memorial Arboretum in Staffordshire. Accompanied by Her Majesty the Queen, of course, just talking to Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, as the King inspects the Household Division troops there. In his message to the nation this morning, the King praised the leadership of his great-uncle, Lord Mountbatten, from whom he learned, and I quote, so much about the particular horrors and heroism witnessed in those furthest fields of combat. These veterans we commemorate here on VJ Day, on the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, were sometimes known as the Forgotten Army. Because in May, after victory in Europe, the home front relaxed a bit, perhaps, because the threat of Nazi Germany was no longer there. But Japan was still a threat in the Far East, and tens of thousands of British and Commonwealth troops fought against them, eventually leading to victory. At around midday, so in around 4 minutes' time, we are expecting a national 2-minute silence led by the King, and His Majesty there just laying a wreath at the memorial as an act of remembrance. The King saluting those fallen comrades. The Queen has now been given a bouquet of flowers as it is approaching the memorial and is laying it down next to His Majesty the King's wreath. I can tell you that Her Majesty is wearing a white pleated chiffon dress by Dior and a white Philip Tracy hat. Her Majesty even is wearing the Rifles brooch, which Her Majesty is Colonel-in-Chief of. The Prime Minister laying a wreath alongside their Majesties, paying tributes to the forces who fought in the Far East 80 years ago today. We are just seeing a senior member of the Navy, I believe the Admiral of the fleet, laying a wreath. And we are also joined by Michael Ellis in the studio here at GBNews. Michael.
Hello, Cameron, and yes, we just saw the Chief of the Defence Staff there, Admiral Radakin, laying a wreath, and His Majesty wearing a summer uniform. But this is such an important ceremonial occasion to mark what really will be one of the very last occasions where there are living veterans albeit extremely elderly, of this signal theatre, this battle for civilization, as it was perceived at the time and still is now. Emperor Hirohito of Japan declared his surrender and his imperial forces' surrender on this day 80 years ago today. And the formal surrender actually took place on board an American warship, the USS Missouri, a couple of weeks later on the 2nd of September. But one thing I think should be recalled, and that is this. People have criticized the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but prior to that happening, the President of the United States, Harry Truman, had called the Potsdam Conference. And at the Potsdam Conference in July of 1945, he warned the Japanese that there would be very serious consequences if they did not surrender. They declined to surrender. And a few days later, America dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. There was a further decline of surrender, and Nagasaki was then bombed. But this is a solemn occasion, as you can see, with the military band playing now the music that we often hear at these occasions to mark the somber occasion of the loss of so many lives. I mean, after all, the British and Allied forces knew full well how vicious a fighting force the Japanese were. They didn't believe in surrender for themselves, and they therefore fought to the death. And that meant that Allied losses were extremely significant. At the Battle of Okinawa, just a few months before the end of the war, March 1945, there were thousands of Allied soldiers killed, tens of thousands, in fact, 82,000 plus American casualties alone. So we see now this event organised by the Royal British Legion at the National Memorial Arboretum in Staffordshire, where the royal family, of course, who have always marked the events of World War II as part of the national framework of this country, as part of its constitutional makeup, you might say, recognising the sacrifice of so many and the subjugation of so many in what was effectively, Cameron, a form of slavery.
Well, now for the 2 minutes.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. Thank you.
I'm okay.
The national 2-minute silence
Yeah.
to commemorate.
When you go home, tell them of us. And for your tomorrows, we give our todays.
Well move to the left in freeze. Forward freeze. Left.
You just heard Owen Filer there recite the phrase, when you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today, before the 2-minute silence. We heard from Ronald Gumley, and he is 101 years old. He was in the RAF, he's from Birmingham, and he volunteered to join the RAF in 1943 at the age of 18, and he was sent across the world, and he was served in the postal service, guiding postal drops onto the beaches of Burma and Bangladesh. And he knew it was important work because he knew that it was the only contact from home that those serving soldiers had back in 1943 and 1944. So he knew he had to send those letters to those people who were fighting in Burma. And on VJ Day itself, he was on his way to Singapore, but there wasn't much cause for celebration, he says, because they could still see kamikaze planes flying overhead. So it must have been very frightening.
Really, really poignant stuff there. Thanks indeed, Cameron Walker. Well, you're now listening to a special edition of Good Afternoon Britain with me, Tom Harwood, Dawn Neeson as well.
Yeah.
So Michael Ellis also joins us in the studio, the former Attorney General, constitutional expert too.
Hello, Tom.
This is a moment that often is not held in, I suppose, such wider psyche amongst the British people. We tend to think VE Day, job done. But there was so much British territory in the Far East, so many sort of totem elements of what Britain was and our global reach, that this really mattered.
Oh, it really mattered. And Tom, the phenomenon that you're describing about what some people have called the Forgotten War is not a modern phenomenon. Even in the years after World War II, there were those that described the Forgotten Army. There was a suggestion that a leading general of the region, a British general of the region, Viscount Slim, had made some reference to a Forgotten Army. But of course, the service that those men performed for their country was of the most considerable importance, both strategic importance, but also moral and psychological importance for all of the Allied powers. The losses, by the way, were significant, and even after VE Day, thousands of British servicemen lost their lives in the continuing conflict, and many, many thousands more would have lost their lives had the conflict not been brought to an end by the American actions in August 1945.
Why do you think it is so forgotten, Michael? I mean, I watched a documentary the other night where some of the very few surviving veterans, incredibly brave men, were talking about what they experienced, and the stories they were telling were chilling, beyond evil.
Oh, yes.
But so why is this so forgotten compared to VE Day?
I think partly, it's difficult to say, Dawn, but I think partly this is because the conflict in Europe was closer to home to the British. The Nazis were the ones that had been hitting London and hitting throughout, in fact, the United Kingdom during the Blitz. And people were so war-weary, they were so exhausted from conflict, that when the opportunity came in VE Day to mark the end of the war at that time in Europe, I think they took that opportunity, and understandably so. But I don't think it's right to say that it was forgotten. It might feel that way. It might have felt that way afterwards, but there were many sacrifices.
I wonder if there might too have been a political element here. There had been a general election 2 months earlier. The Conservative Party was talking, of course, about how the war must be won, but the Labour Party was saying, no, win the peace. And that's what won the election, the surprisingly large general election victory for Clement Attlee and the Labour Party in
Churchill
that election.
kicked out, of course.
Churchill, of course, kicked out in what many people think of as a bit of a surprise, although there were some trends in what few polls we had back then. But there's also something deeper here. The places that were defeated throughout the course of that war and then won back: Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaya, Burma, Borneo, the Islands, British territory, where the sort of myth of the British Empire was broken. The fall of Singapore, such a poignant moment in the course of this
Probably
war.
our biggest, the feeling was that Singapore, the loss of Singapore, was one of our biggest defeats of World War II.
And to some extent, that's what broke the myth of the British Empire. After the fall of Singapore, this area of the world over which Britain once exerted so much dominance was forever broken.
That's right, Tom, and it's actually one of those things that that concerned Churchill a great deal in the years after the war. A regret that he felt was the loss of empire. He was one of the last old-school Victorian imperialists, of course, and he believed in that fervently. The reality is that it marked the decline of the British Empire, and of course it marked the new order, the post-World War II order, which is what people were voting for, as you pointed out.
Which is why this is such an interesting memorial. In some way, a victory, of course.
Yes.
That the Allies won, defeated the Axis powers. Such military bravery and victory. But also for Britain, in some strange way, a loss too.
Well, it was a loss, and in fact, it was a loss that took a great deal of time to get over. Dawn's point about the deprivations, in fact, the torture, the cruelty, the inhumanity that had been suffered by Allied personnel in the Far East under Japanese capture, tens of thousands died as a result of their captivity. They were cruelly malnourished, they were tortured, there were summary executions, they were denied medical treatment. Many died of blackwater fever, which is an aggravated form of malaria. There were stories of sores, leg sores that were a foot long because they couldn't be treated. People working in extreme heat and humidity in jungle conditions on the Burma Railway. In fact, one of the memorials in Staffordshire at the Arboretum is actually constructed from part of the original wooden beams of the Burma Railway to commemorate the sacrifice of those who fell.
Just extraordinary stories. So, Michael, do stay with us. We will be back to this, of course, but we can take you live now to Joint Base Andrews, just outside Washington, D.C., where President Donald Trump is about to depart for his historic meeting with Vladimir Putin in Anchorage, Alaska. This, the air base where they keep all of the planes that become Air Force One. Of course, it becomes Air Force One as soon as Donald Trump steps on board that plane. And we're given to understand that we're looking at the plane there that Donald Trump is about to board.
A relatively short flight, and of course Alaska important because it was once owned by Russia, which sold it to America for, I understand, a very
About $7 million.
a very small amount of money comparative